was approximately 11 o'clock, and I received a call from Sandy. She was on her cellular phone, driving in her Camry, and she said that she was on her way to the chiropractor's, which was nothing unusual. Sandy was extremely health conscious. She's never smoked, never did drugs, always perfect weight throughout her entire life. She's just been a real health, I won't say fanatic, but extremely careful about eating sweets and that sort of thing, and drinking purified water at home, and just extremely health conscious. And chiropractic was part of her routine, so she always believed in this maintenance theory, and she did see him a lot. On our way back to my shop, I received a call from Sandy. It was a very quick call. She sounded desperate on my cell. She said, David, come and get me. And I said, well, where are you? And she said, well, I can't drive, I can't see, everything is spinning, I've pulled off the road, come get me quick. I'm scared. Pulled up to her, we went in front of her initially, and I went back to the car, and she was just staring out the window. I went to the Camry, and I put my head, I opened the door, and I said, what's going on? Are you okay? And she said, no, I'm not okay. Something's really wrong, David. I took her to the closest hospital, which was the Royal Alexandra. They got her into the emergency room fairly quickly. I don't know what suspicions they had, but initially the first doctor, young doctor that looked at her, closed the curtain and said, well, I don't know, but he said, it sounds like your wife could be having the first signs of a stroke. And I thought, well, he can't be right. She's 41 years old, she's never smoked, she's never even taken a birth control pill in her life, she's the most healthy person and has an identical twin. How on earth could this be happening, a stroke? I think the doctor's missing something here. But minutes later, Sandy started to choke, and her voice started to change and become slurred. But when she really started choking, she sat upright into on the bed there, and I panicked because I could tell her throat, something was wrong. She couldn't breathe properly. So I ripped the curtain open and I yelled for a doctor, and they came running, and they wheeled her right away over to another section in the emergency department within the same room. But while Sandy was laying there, she started convulsing and shaking to the point where I'd never seen anyone shake like that. The whole body, the whole bed, everything was shaking, and her eyes were rolling back in her head. And I started to panic. And they immediately fast-tracked the MRI procedure, rolled her into MRI, and it was very terrifying at that moment for me, because I felt that. Well, I knew it was very bad. When Sandy was in that room at one point, just prior to her, before the choking, the breathing issues started, she said to the doctor there, am I going to die? And he said, no, of course you're not going to die. And I thought, well, maybe Sandy's just overreacting or something. And she was wheeled back out of the MRI room. I looked at Sandy, and she was no longer able to talk. She had tears rolling down her eyes, and her eyes were rolled back in her head. And they wheeled her past me quickly, and they said, Mr. Nette, we've done all we can for your wife. And I said, what are you talking about? What do you mean you've done all you can? And they said, no, we're going to get her in an ambulance, and we're going to rush her over to a waiting team of specialists. They're gathering now. We've already contacted them, and she's going to go to the university hospital. Your wife is suffering a serious stroke, and I'll never forget Dr. Norbert Witt, older doctor, and he looked over his bispectacled glasses, and he looked right at me, and he said, and of course I was still going from the shock that they've done all they can for my wife, but I remember him looking at me, and he said, chiropractor, right? And I thought, what is he talking about? I couldn't hardly believe what I was hearing, and yet I was thinking, well, yes. I said, she's just been at a chiropractor. She's literally just come from there minutes ago. And he made the comment that this was not uncommon. I went over to the table where they were preparing Sandy. They were intubating her, putting a tube down her throat so she could breathe, stabilizing her for the trip, hooking up the IVs. We raced across Edmonton, but it seemed like it took an eternity. But we did get there fairly quickly to the university, and we bypassed emergency, and in a relatively short order, she was upstairs, and they were operating on her. It was hours and hours and hours, and at one point, after 4 hours, we said, gee, give us something, tell us something, because I was going out of my mind. It was an angiogram of sorts, and they used a drip to dissolve the blood clot. They explained to me later that her vertebral artery had a dissection. That's what caused the blood clot in her brainstem, and hence the strokes. There's damage to both sides, but on the one side it was ripped 3 inches long, and they didn't think she was going to live.
Right.
In fact, most of the doctors that I talked to said if she does live, she will basically have the communication of what you see now, and that's a blinking eye. They said, how far do you want us to go to resuscitate her if she has a heart attack or a brain aneurysm? Well, on the table, because it's not uncommon for this type of injury for people when they get this drug, the drip, to have other issues. And they didn't hold out a lot of hope. They asked me at that time if we had a strong faith. I told them that Sandy and I had just had dinner a couple of nights prior, and we had talked about this very subject, that if anything had ever happened. In fact, I'm the one 10 years older than Sandy, and I remember saying to my wife, Sandy, if I'm ever in a situation where I'm drooling and looking at some ceiling and hooked up to a pile of machines, would you please trip over the plug, honey? And she said she'd see what she could do. And then 48 hours later, we're in this situation. It's just absolutely ironic. We had talked about slowing down a little bit and enjoying life a little bit more. That day was a very, very long day, but I remember saying to the surgeons, do what you can for Sandy. She's a fighter, she's young, she's extremely healthy in every respect. She's always kept herself in perfect shape, and she'll do her part, God will do his part, and hopefully you guys can do your part, and in the end I'll still have a wife, and she'll have a life. And I was able to see her in the ICU. When I looked at the, well, you know what the ICU is like. It's not a pretty sight. But I knew immediately that Sandy was still with us. Despite all of the medications, she was awake. She didn't sleep for about 11 days. In fact, they didn't understand why she couldn't sleep. Little bits here and there she would grab, but she had to be continually, they trached her, of course, and put the breathing tube down her throat. But between all of the suctioning and everything else that goes along with these types of procedures, and just the terror I could see in her eyes of being aware of every inch of her body, being able to feel everything, hot, cold sensations. And we established very early on, I remember being there that night and having the nurse pry her contact lenses off of her eyes. It was hard to get the contact lenses off, but I mentioned that this was something that she did every night. You'd have to take those lenses off or they'd dry in your eyes. And I brought Sandy's glasses, but it was the beginning of our nightmare.